Welcome, Dr. Cat Jarman, to Team Teatime. It's very nice to be able to talk with someone who's an expert in the Viking world. And I wondered how you got into archaeology in the first place, and then how you ended up in the world of the Vikings.
That's a good question. So it was almost a bit by accident for me. I didn't set out to become an archaeologist at all. I was always interested as a child. I grew up in Norway, and the Vikings were just all around me, which go on school visits to see Viking ships and so on. I actually came to England to study architecture and realized I absolutely hated it. And happened to watch a documentary, I think actually might have been Time Team, on TV, and realized that was just combining all my interests together. So I ended up changing course, starting to study archaeology at Bristol University, and eventually wanted to combine my background and what I'd grown up with, the Vikings at home, with that archaeology. So I started studying the Vikings in England, which is great because it's a bit like me, but 1,000 years before. So trying to see that impact, that exchange and migration across the North Sea has been really fantastic.
And we asked you to have a look at a time team from about 2000, I think it was, in York, and you kindly did that. What was it like watching a time team from all those years ago, and which bits of it were there bits of it that stuck out and you thought, oh, that was a nice moment, or how did you feel about it?
Yeah, that was really interesting, and I enjoyed watching the one because that was the episode in York, and seeing obviously everything from the method, from the starting point of the geophysics and what you were discovering. I was really liked watching a program like that as well, where you had the different parts of a city. So you had the Roman history, the Viking history, and the later medieval history, which is really what we see everywhere, really, isn't it? It's that sort of sites and time period upon time period together, and how that's all evolved. So I really love seeing those sections. But actually seeing the Viking bit, obviously, is the most interesting part, and seeing sort of the house, the building that was being excavated, seeing all the different evidence, which ties in with new stuff that we're finding now. So about 20 years later, I've been researching a lot of the early towns and early urban settlements across Scandinavia, looking at sites like Ribe and Kaupang, for example. And it's exactly what you were finding in York. So it's these thin plots, it's the craft works, it's the traded. So you had a beautiful bead, which again I've been just studying literally this last week, how these beads turn up all over Scandinavia, how they're being traded. And it shows how York and England was really part of this huge big network. The same things were happening all the way across around the North Sea, across the Baltic. And I thought that was really, really lovely. But that plus the sort of human side, you get a shoe, it's reminds me of a shoe, that's a real person. Those sort of unique individual lives that fit into that big picture, which I think that program really got across to me. So I very much enjoyed watching that episode.
In your journey through the Viking world, are there some objects? If I was asking you to create Cat Jarman's museum of the past, which would be the objects you'd stick in there first? And you can have anything you like, but are there some objects that in your archaeological journey have stuck in your mind?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting question. Tricky one as well to answer. I quite often like the things that most other people don't really like so much. The things that tell us more about either daily life, or that tell us about sort of big wider pictures. For instance, the work I've been doing at the Viking camp in Rapton, we found ship nails, different Viking ship nails, which I think is fantastic because you are really far inland. It's about as far inland in England as you can get, and then you're finding these ship nails. But they tell us about the fact that people are using the rivers to tell us about the boats, and they tell us really that story. The same matching nails that we then find in Scandinavia and in Eastern Ukraine, we're finding them all over the place. So they tell a really important story. I love those items. And I guess fragments of weapons as well are quite interesting because you don't get the whole nice, full, shiny axe or the shiny sword unless it's in a burial. But if you're looking for a battle or something like that, you will only find little fragments. You might find an arrowhead. So I'd have some of those tiny little fragments that tell a little snippet of the story. I'd have those definitely.
And you mentioned, Repton. We've worked with I think we've worked Martin Biddle on some sites, and I remember the extraordinary picture of the battle burial site at Repton. It was the one picture I've ever seen that made me think that's what a Viking burial pit should look like. Bodies all over the place, sword injuries and things. And Martin, with his partner, believed that that was a site of the great sort of winter army camping in Britain about 900,
Yeah, 873.
873.
Yeah.
And what was I thought was lovely about that was that there was some doubt about it, because when they did the radiocarbon dating, it didn't quite match. But you got involved at a later stage, and tell us what happened.
Yeah, so it was really puzzling. So Martin and Birte, his late wife, who was originally from Denmark, they proposed that this was a Great Army site, and everything seemed to make sense. All the archaeology, our traditional sort of archaeology, suggested that, but then the radiocarbon dates were at least 200 years too early. So it seemed to sort of say, no, you're wrong. And so part of my PhD research was looking at the bones and looking at those radiocarbon dates. So I looked at what's called marine reservoir effects, so looking at fish consumption, which can affect radiocarbonates quite severely. And nobody had really done that before, but I was able to show that in all those cases where the date seemed too early, that was actually caused by somebody eating quite a lot of fish. So that completely shifted the date, and he took all those early dates, put them right into line, right into the late 9th century, which is exactly what Martin and Birte had said all along. So it was just the science sort of having to catch up really with what they said back in the 80s, which
I
was a
always,
really nice thing.
I always imagined that there must have been a rather good party at Martin's place to celebrate with Beata, hopefully, that after all those years, I think it was 10 years, wasn't it, at the time it took for the
Oh,
research.
it was much, yeah, it was much longer. We only published it, I think about 3 years ago now, and the site was dug up in the 1980s. The dates came out in the 90s. So unfortunately, Beata had passed away, so she was never able to see those results. But I was so delighted when I could go and see Martin and say, look, I've got I've got something to show you. That was one of the nicest moments. I think it was just, and it was showing that actually science was backing up what he was thinking from the archaeology. Which is really great. So those conclusions made back in the 80s were still valid in nearly 40 years later.
Now, without getting too technical, it's a bit early in the morning for that, but how does eating fish apparently affect the degree to which our bones absorb the material that we use to carbon date something? What is it? How does that work?
So it's all based on the source of the carbon. So when we radiocarbon date bone, we are essentially dating that carbon that you've got into your system from your diet. So if you're only eating land-based food, so meat and fruit and veg and whatever, then that's all come from the atmosphere, and we can deal with those radiocarbon dates like we normally do. But if you eat any fish or any seafood, then you're also eating carbon that's come from the oceans. And the problem is that that carbon has been circulating around in the oceans for a very long time. So you're basically eating really old carbon, and that's what confuses it. So when we do that radiocarbon date, you get some of the sort of nice current carbon and then some of the really old carbon. And if we don't know that difference, then it just gets really confusing. So basically, if you were to radiocarbon date a fish and a sheep who died on the same day, say, in 1000 AD, it would look to you like the fish died on average about 400 years before the sheep, even though they were killed on the same day. And it's that different that's passed on into a human body. So if you ate the fish, then that old carbon would also be in your body. So if we don't know that, then we are going to get very confusing results.
I sort of have some slight vision of Vikings sitting around eating fish and chips way back in the past and creating havoc 1,000
Yeah.
years later. When you think of Vikings over here, I think my first Viking picture was a recreation that Victor did of the raid on Lindisfarne. And as you probably know, I think in Britain we tend to sort of clump all the Vikings together as, Vikings. And in fact, I think Viking is almost more of a verb describing an activity, to go Viking. Um, but that drawing that Victor did, that wonderful painting, was my introduction to reconstruction like that. The origins of Vikings, as opposed to Saxons, if you like, where do you now look at as the homeland of the Vikings?
Yeah, so it's a really important question, and it's one we need to think about quite a lot, I think, because we tend to, as you said, we sort of very much say the Vikings as a very distinct, very specific thing, but we do still think of the Vikings as originating in Norway and Sweden and Denmark, the Scandinavian countries originally. But from that point on, from when they start moving outwards from Scandinavia, that's when it gets really mixed, and it gets much more complicated. You have people moving out of Scandinavia, but also coming back in, and a lot of the new evidence and new research, including a quite new genetic study that just came out, is showing that. So you have all these people going out, but then they actually have so much mixing with other cultures, including in England, in Scottish Isles, in Ireland, and going onwards to places like Iceland and Greenland, all those going east. And they get a lot of input from those other societies, other cultures coming back in again as well. And that's really, really important. So what we know as Viking is actually a bit of a melting pot of cultures. And actually in somewhere like York, you see that really, really well. So those things that you found in that house, in that episode I watched, those people who worked there, who lived there, who did the craft work, I don't know what they would have thought of themselves. They certainly would have called themselves Vikings because they didn't really use that term. Scandinavian, maybe. I mean, again, another word that they wouldn't have used. But they would probably have had quite a mix. So they would have some people, so maybe they had relative ancestors coming across from Scandinavia. They might be intermarrying with the locals, and so it's all a bit of a mix, really. But there is something very specific, what we call Vikings, in terms of things like the art, the languages, the culture. So there is a core Viking, but he or she would necessarily not have called himself that, I think.
When I think of Viking people that, in a sense, are atypical, I was reading a little bit about the Birka cemetery, and in particular the girl that they found in the Birka cemetery, which reflected another aspect of Viking life, not the warriors at sea, but I suppose, the women at home, the family of the Vikings. And that there seems to be another story there that we don't usually get. In our history, they're charging up the beaches and chasing monks around. But to see the Birka burials gives you an extraordinary richness of a home life. Have you had much to do with that side of the Viking world?
Yeah, I have. So I worked quite a lot on Viking women, actually, and the roles of Viking women in society. And that's something that started out as I said, very much just focused on men going out, women staying home, being very passive, and not really taking a part. They just, things happen to these Viking women, and they just have things coming back to them. But we actually know a lot more now, some of it through the bioarchaeology, which is a lot of my work, which is looking at evidence for migration. We now know that women were actually quite heavily involved in the migrations. They were moving out into England as well. Other women from abroad were coming back in, and not just as slaves, which is the other sort of typical image I think that people have. We know they're a very active part of it. They're also involved in a lot of things like textiles industry, which is hugely important because the effort and the resources that were needed for a sail being the crucial part of the Viking ship, is extraordinary. You have several years worth of work to produce one single sail, and we know women were very heavily involved in that as well. And there's quite a lot of power in that sort of part of industry. And we see those connections. So I think the fact that women are moving in and out quite a lot, and you have to start thinking about what parts of society, what parts of culture do maybe women have responsibility for? Things like language, the idea of mother tongue. Are we actually getting women teaching their language to their children? and so on. So it is a really rich picture, and I think recent research is definitely adding to that an awful lot.
You mentioned Viking boats. A long time ago, I'd play around in boats a little bit, and I had this phrase that I got from somewhere, which was something like, "Bound is the boatless man." And there's something essentially beautiful. And Johannes Bronsted, I read a quote from him in which he said, "What the temple was to the Greeks, the ship was to the Vikings." And having luckily had a chance to see some of the wonderful museums with boats in, when you stand there, that beautiful shape has more to it than just practicality. You are on your way to the next stage in your career, I suppose, which is connected with the whole aspect of boats. And do you want to talk about what's your favorite Viking boat of the list you have, of the list I've managed to get?
Right. Oh, that's another good question. I do have a very sort of special place in my heart for the Oseberg ship, which is one of the ships at the museum in Oslo that I'm working for at the moment, because this was the ship that I went to see when I think I was about 9 or 10 on a school visit. We had to go around and fill in, things from a sheet of A4, and I remember getting stuck there, just looking up and feeling so just completely awestruck about the fact that you have this beautifully preserved ship, more than 1,000 years old. And it was there, and obviously I was a very good girl, so I didn't touch it, but I could have done if I wanted to. And that could also have been touched by a Viking. And that was a beautiful ship in itself, but it was also the grave of two women, two very powerful women. And so just to think of the whole life story of that ship is incredible. But those are the kind of big spectacular ones. I also, I'm really interested in the smaller scale things. So things like in the East, we know that people use log boats. They found a logboat quite recently. So what was the actual daily boat that you had if you were living in Scandinavia or in England or wherever? What sort of boat? It wouldn't have been the Oseberg ship. That was if you were a really high status, high power person. But those little boats that actually took you across the rivers, across the fjords. You went shopping essentially to the marketplace. What sort of a boat were we using? And I think that quite a few they really were, the boats were such a crucial part of everyday life, not just raids, but also trade. So yes, I think the Oseberg ship definitely top of my list, but then some of the smaller ones alongside.
I remember talking to Damien Goodburn, who did a lot of reconstructions for us, boat reconstructions, about the difficulties of radially splitting oak to create those long, amazingly shaped planks that go on the boat. And to think those boats, what's your feeling about the crossing to America, the Ants sur la Meadow idea that actually the Vikings got to America first?
Yeah, I think that's pretty certain that they did. What's really interesting about that, especially, I think, is because it was very short-lived, and we haven't found evidence that they kind of stayed or that that settlement lasted for very long. I know there's various projects going on, so I'd be really interested to revisit that to see what new explorations could come up. I think the fact that the Vikings could get there is wonderful, to both the technology of the ships and also navigation, and courage, I guess, that you would just go across the sea that far. But I think it does demonstrate both the abilities in terms of technology, resources, knowing how to treat that wood, just exactly as you're saying, how to split it, how to create the boat. But then also, what you could then do with it and how you would explore the world. But I think that very far western reach of the Viking world is a really, really fascinating one. And I just wonder, could there be more that we haven't found yet? And see.
And what's your view on the reason for that Viking diaspora, that urge to go? What stimulated that massive, great, probably one of the great European moments of them having the boats and traveling to Russia, to possibly to America? What produced the stimulus to make that happen, do you think?
I think it's quite a wide series of things together. I don't think there's a single reason. I think it's a combination of the technology. So suddenly you have these ships, you have the capability And they are so brilliant in that they can go across seas all the way across to somewhere like America, but they can also go down rivers and fjords. So suddenly you've got a very, very powerful way of stretching out far beyond your homeland. But then you also have the increased trade happening. You have some networks opening up, starting a little bit before what we typically think of as the Viking Age. Around about sort of 700 or so, you start getting these smaller trading settlements, and they have contact even across the North Sea before the Viking Age starts. They bring a lot of things back into Scandinavia as well. So not just the things that are being raided. So you talked about Lindisfarne earlier, and that's the sort of often seen as the starting point. Suddenly they get all these wealth and things that are being stolen. But you also have that trade element. You have networks opening up, especially in the Eastern Baltic. And you start getting quite quickly things like silver that actually come from the East, that come from the Islamic territories and the Arabic world. And silver becomes one of the huge big things for the Vikings. There's this huge vast hunger for silver actually that fuels a lot of movement outwards and trade. So I think it's a combination of that. I think there's pressure at home, there's population pressure. There's not a lot of good farmland in Scandinavia. So if you look at Norway, for example, just look at a map or Google an image of Norway, and you'll see quite quickly why you can't really have a lot of cows and a lot of grain growing there. So there's internal pressures and political pressures, and it's always like this perfect storm of things all happening at once. And then you get reports back of other people being successful abroad, and we see that now. You hear of other people traveling, people going on gap years, and all these experiences that you also want a part of. I think people back in 750 or 800 AD were exactly the same as us. They want a part of it as well when they see something successful abroad.
We were lucky enough to have a chat with Bernard Cornwell about all sorts of aspects of Anglo-Saxon Viking life. As you know, in his books, there's some spectacular battle scenes, and in Britain, there probably were many moments of confrontation between essentially the Vikings and the Anglo-Saxons. And battle sites, people get interested in these, they're very difficult to find. Were there some particular battles that you think were critical or important?
Yeah, certainly a few that we know of from the written records, and Brunanburh, the Battle of Brunanburh is one of those, which I know that Bernard's very interested in as well. I think some of the earlier ones as well. So I'm very much based in the 9th century myself. I'm very interested in looking for the Battle of Edington, which was essentially a sort of decisive battle between the Vikings and King Alfred. It's one of those that's known about from a lot of written sources, but we've never been able to find it. And it is really difficult. How do you find a battle? They're kind of short-lived. You don't have necessarily a lot of material culture left behind. So that is one that I'm particularly keen to find, actually.
And when we often look at time teams from the past, we bump into those moments of where suddenly the past comes alive. And I think I talked to you about the Isle of Man site, where we found a burial of Vikings, including a female burial with a hair still on her head in a kind of, you could almost see the style she'd created. And during that dig, one of the diggers, Matt, had the good sense to look at a slate and find some Ogham writing, some runic writing. And I suppose one of the things about the Vikings is that the origins of that early writing beginning to fill in the historic records, but there's not a lot of it, is there? Or is there? I don't know. Where is the documentary sources that are from the Viking sources themselves?
Yeah, so that's not a good question. So I think you were talking about an Ogham inscription, which is actually the Gaelic inscriptions rather than the Viking ones, but it would have been another written language that certainly those Scandinavians or Vikings who were in the Scottish Isles came across. We do get runic inscriptions in the Scandinavian homelands, but they didn't write any sort of longer text. They're very, very short. And they mainly found, or there's a lot more of them towards the end of the Viking Age, where places like Sweden, we get these runestones that describe things like journeys, that describe names, where people have gone and so on. But we don't have those same written records that you have in England, for example. So there's a lot we don't know. A lot of the inscriptions are very short. There are things like just a name, might be somebody owns me, a few words, and we try and work out what on earth they mean. But it does mean that we don't have that definite contemporary record. We have a lot of things like saga literature and various forms of poetry, essentially, that have been passed on, that we can't quite know whether they really relate to certain early Viking Age contexts. Most of them are written down in the 12th, 13th century. But by then, of course, you're several hundred years down, so you've converted to Christianity. It's a different view, so you have to treat them with a bit of sort of sometimes a pinch of salt, really. So that's, I think, what makes the Vikings very unique, in that we don't have that same written record, even that you do if you look at early medieval Anglo-Saxon England.
I remember the moment when Matt found that slate. I don't know if you have ever seen that find, but it was an astonishing. The interpretation we were given by an academic from Oxford, I think, was 20 Vikings harbored, sheltered, stayed here. And to find those few lines in a Viking burial was just astonishing stuff. And it is a very interesting form of writing, where it seems to be lines cut across in some way.
Yeah. So I'm not exactly sure I've seen precisely that inscription that you're talking about there. I don't think I've seen that one.
Yeah.
But no, I mean, having things like that, it's just wonderful, isn't it? Because it just adds a completely different dimension. So that would be my dream find for any of the time. We do turn over every aspect that we think in our writing on it and scrutinize it to see, but I've not been that lucky yet.
One of the things I was going to ask you was you talked about the sagas and things, and what's lovely about some of that content is that there's little clues in that to things we don't know the answer to, and because they love setting strange problems to see if we can sort out what the content is. I was going to ask you if you know how to play Naffl Taffle.
I have been taught it, yes, actually, and even my children learned it at school. So we've been having something. My kids beat me every time, unfortunately. But no, that is a really interesting one, because we do keep finding these gaming pieces now a lot, and they've had a huge impact on understanding the Vikings in England. So then to have those finds in our physical record have the importance, we can read about the importance of the games in the sagas, and they're being used strategically as a sort of, sometimes planning military action, sometimes as a diplomatic a sort of way of dealing with a foreign king. You have these games happening. So yeah, that fills in another gap, doesn't it, in our knowledge, which is really exciting.
And I think I've seen it possibly from Birka, a burial where a figure is sort of curled round the Naffl Taffle, if I'm pronouncing it correctly, the Naffl Taffle, and it begins with an H, so it's Naffl Taffle.
Yeah.
But he or she is actually curled round this board as it's an important possession for them.
Absolutely, and they really, really are. In fact, I've got a little reconstruction that sits on my desk in front of me. It's one of their gaming pieces. I don't know if you can see, it's a glass reconstruction of a gaming piece there from Birka. And they are really important. And if you, an earlier grave, which is an absolutely spectacular Salma ship burial from Estonia, which where there's two actually ships, but the largest boat has I can't remember the number now, but it's over 20 men buried together who clearly died in some kind of battle. Dates to right at the beginning of the Viking Age, around about 750 AD, and there several of them have a complete set of gaming pieces. One of them is buried with the gaming pieces on his lap. Another seems to have the king piece in between his teeth, in his mouth. And it's really, really clear that these games and these sets had a really, really important role in society, and one that you wanted to take with you into the afterlife as well.
And funnily enough, in the course of me looking up Naffl Taffle, I found a research reference to a dig by Time Team on one of the islands in the Western Isles, and we actually found the corner of a Naffl Taffle board. So
Oh, fantastic.
it was quite nice bump into that. Kat, you've got a book that you're working on at the moment, uh, which is always, I know, hard work to get to the end of and everything, coming out in February. What's that all about?
Yeah, so my book's called River Kings, and it is about the Vikings, but it's very much about the Vikings and the connections to the east and to the Silk Road. And it starts actually, when you asked me earlier, I should have said about my favorite object. One of the objects is found in Repton as a carnelian bead that was found during Martin Biddle's excavations there in the 1980s. And it's a bead that comes from somewhere like, quite possibly from India, from a mine there. They're hugely popular in the Viking Age. And when I found out about this bead a few years ago, I was just so intrigued. Why do you have a bead from somewhere like India in a grave, in a Viking Age grave in middle of Derbyshire? So the book is actually retracing the journey of this bead back to the where I think it came from, following the Vikings across the rivers. The rivers were a huge part of the Viking success, especially in Eastern Europe, but also even somewhere like Repton. So it's looking at that, it's looking at those connections going east and sort of trying to take people a little bit beyond the traditional view of the Vikings, talking about things like women and some of that latest scientific research and how that ties in with what we used to think about the Vikings. So it's been a really fun project to research. It's nearly at the end now, so it'll come out next year. And yeah, hopefully tie a few things together.
That sounds really fantastic. I've got a couple of final questions now. We ask people, without giving away any of your secrets, as it were, um, if you had Time Team for a week, they're all going to turn up in a large truck with geophysics equipment and everything, and anybody you like, your fantasy Time Team site. Is there a particular site you'd rather like to do from the past or the future? Where would you like to take us if we turned up?
I think I've already talked about Eddington, and that's very close to me right now physically. It's just down the road from where I live. But that is one that nobody's really looked at physically yet. So I think if I had all those resources, we could do huge scale geophysics, look to see if we could find Alfred's Estate. We know that Alfred had an estate around there. Nobody's really find that as well. Do that, do lots of searches, put in some test pits, and see if we could find the battle and find out what happened. I think that would be top of my list right now.
And it was rather nice somehow. Well, I'd like to feel that you originally got started in archaeology by chance, watching a Time Team maybe. Um, do you think there would be a good reason for getting Time Team back? And what would it be?
Absolutely. Yeah, I think so. I think everyone's just desperately hoping it's going to come back. I think there's actually been quite a lot happening in archaeology in terms of methods and in terms of new developments since Time Team ended. And I think it would be amazing to bring that back and see, well, actually, what have we got to now, and how can we use those, especially a lot of the geophysics that you're using, and take some really, really exciting sites and try and sort of bring back that spirit. Time Team had such a huge impact on both the whole discipline, so us as academics as well, people like myself who directly were affected by it and inspired to go into the subject ourselves, but also the general public and the way that we interact with and show what we do. And if we could take all those new developments, new methods, new technology, and bring that out to people, I think that's a really good reason for bringing it back in 2021 or whenever.
Dr. Cat Jarman, well, thank you very much, Cat. Very nice to have talked to you. Thrilling to think how things are moving forward in the Viking world. We'll look forward to your book called The River Kings, coming out in February, and I look forward to discussing more potential sites with you in the Viking world at some point in the future. Stay well. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for having me. It was great talking.